Some years back, a friend of our son asked him what his mom's go-to word was. What was her mantra, so to speak? With little hesitation, he said my word was nurture. I'm not sure I would have landed on that word. I certainly had lots of others, including a few colorful ones I sometimes resorted to while trying to raise two wild and crazy teenage boys. I think there were plenty of occasions when their behavior may have warranted this not always so gentle reminder: your job as a human being is to nurture others, not to tear them down. But the thing is, I truly believed those words then, and I still believe them now. When we help people feel seen and loved, when we do whatever we can to uplift them and help them grow, I think we're being our best selves. As some of you know, I spent many years teaching at a juvenile detention center. Although it wasn't a place I imagined working at ever in my life, I think it was exactly where I was meant to be. It was the place where I learned the most about loving and nurturing. It was there I came to fully understand that we are all connected. We all have the need to feel seen and loved for who we are. As you might imagine, a juvenile detention center is a cold institution. Kids have little privacy there, and they don't make a move without first getting permission from a staff member. They have no access to cell phones or the internet. Television is limited and closely monitored. Their meals, prepared by inmates at the nearby jail, consist of a lot of white bread, rice, and beans. Knowing all this, it's unbelievable anyone would ever deliberately want to return to detention. Yet that's precisely what happened with a boy named Devin. When he first came to the juvenile detention center, Devin was a total mess. I'm sure that on the outside, this boy could display as much swagger and attitude as any other teenager. However, as a newbie in this locked facility, he didn't even try to fake an air of machismo. Alone in a cell and feeling distraught and homesick, he wailed loudly for days and nights on end. He was utterly miserable, and he didn't seem to care who heard him. He remained inconsolable, his loud, continuous crying carrying throughout the building and making it difficult for the other kids to sleep. Days passed, and at long last, Devin's tears began to subside. Finally, one day he showed up in class. He seemed reticent and subdued at first, his eyes still bloodshot and puffy. He appeared to study the other students carefully and to take his cues from their behavior. In time, he began to relax and join in class activities. Eventually, he even started smiling, a little timidly at first. And then at some point, I marveled to see an ear-to-ear grin plastered on his face. As he continued to evolve, that broad smile quickly became a regular part of his appearance. All of his sadness had disappeared, and he began to participate enthusiastically in school. He became more comfortable with the staff, adults who engaged him in games of checkers, taught him how to play chess, and were always ready to listen. From the respectful treatment he experienced, he seemed to understand there were a lot of people outside his family who were rooting for his success. His court hearings were scheduled every couple weeks, but things did not progress quickly. There was one continuance after another as mental health workers, attorneys, and the judge all worked together to determine what should happen to him next. Before it was all over, he had spent a few months in detention. Finally, the day of his sentencing arrived. Since it had been his first offense, and since it wasn't a felony, he was placed on probation and immediately released at court to his grandmother. What a happy outcome. All of us who had worked with him were thrilled. That is, until the local police brought him back later that night. What in the world would possess this healthy teenage boy to want to come back to a locked detention facility. Yes, indeed, he apparently really did want to come back, because he went to the police station shortly after 11 o'clock that first night. Determined to turn himself in, he told the officers to take him to JDC because he was out past curfew and had just violated his probation. We could only speculate why. Was Devin afraid he couldn't adhere to the rules of his probation? Was he concerned he couldn't resist the temptations of peer pressure on the outside? He'd become accustomed to the routine of living inside that cold institution. Despite all its restrictions, he'd been surrounded by caring, supportive adults. Was it possible that that life suddenly felt safer and more comforting than his life was in the outside world? I saw other kids just like Devin over the years who came back to detention repeatedly and seemed to sense peace in that building. One year before Valentine's Day, my colleague Katie suggested we make special Valentines for each of the kids. With the help of the detention officers, we came up with a list of positive qualities of each student. In all honesty, it may have required us to dig a little deeper for some kids, and sometimes we may have had to exercise a little creativity with our wording. Eventually, however, we came up with plenty of wonderful, affirming descriptors for every student, all of it heartfelt and real. We created and printed a personalized Valentine for each one. With their names prominently displayed, we acknowledged our gratitude for them. Then we listed all the things that made them so special to us, all their glorious attributes. We even sprang for colored ink, a rare treat considering our meager budget. The response from the students when we presented the Valentine was quite extraordinary. They were visibly moved, more deeply than I would ever imagined. It was as if they just couldn't believe people saw those wonderful traits in them. They read the Valentines, and they read them over and over again. Then after school, they took them to their rooms. They kept them close at hand, something to treasure for days to come. Reflecting later, I came to believe that little project was just as valuable to us adults as it had been to the students. Although it required very little time and effort, it led us to focus on the good in each of those young people in our charge. It asked us to forget for a moment all their glaring flaws, their irritating habits, and even the misdeeds that had landed them in detention. Instead, our gaze settled on the personal finest of each child, the divine light of Christ that every one of them has. This simple activity provided both a thrilling delight and a heavy sadness. The kids were so elated by what we'd done, but on the other hand, the reactions seemed to point to what was lacking in their lives. The level of utter disbelief they displayed when they read their Valentines revealed how rarely they ever felt affirmed. It indicated what little self-worth they possessed. Our brains tend to default to the negative, and we often let hurtful or critical thoughts run on an endless loop in our minds. Some say that for every damaging thought one has, it takes 10 positive affirmations to equalize it. I realized then that most kids in detention were not used to receiving praise for much of anything. The significant deficits they were operating with suddenly became glaring. The memories Katie and I have of that activity remain deeply rooted and bittersweet. They serve to remind us of how very important it is to reach out to validate others. Our sister Jill does the same sort of thing with family and friends. Whenever we're celebrating somebody's birthday, about the time they bring out the cake and ice cream, she encourages everyone to name one thing they admire about the birthday person. It sometimes brings back memories of things that happened years ago. Sometimes it helps us all see facets of the honoree we might have overlooked. Sometimes people build on the things others have mentioned. But every time we do this, it is wonderful. Wonderful to celebrate the one among us and also to feel the strength of all of our interconnections. 1 year back in detention, we were beginning a unit on poetry unit. The students were eager to write and share their own poetry. So we decided to set aside some time every Friday for open mic time. The day before the first performance, one of the students suggested I should also write a poem. I don't know, I said reluctantly. Honestly, I was thinking of the short time I would have to write, especially when I would get home and my evening would be busy with dinner, family, and household tasks. Come on, Mrs. Kidd, a couple of the other students encouraged. We're all writing poems, so you should write one too. I don't know, I repeated in an attempt to get myself off the hook. What would I write about? You can write about us. Write about teaching us. Well, it didn't take long for my brain to kick into high gear. I decided I would try to write a rap about my students when I got home. Now, I didn't know the first thing about rap, but I had a son in high school who listened to it. I was hoping he'd help me put something together, something the kids would like. Just imagine an older white woman trying to spit and flow. I thought it would be light and funny, and that they would at least appreciate my effort. Later that evening, my son and I sat down at the computer. We did try, but at some point we realized that coming up with words to spill out in that particular rhythmic way required a special talent that neither of us had. Around 10:30, he gave up and went to bed, leaving me all on my own. I was left with no choice except to move on to plan B. Forget the rap and just throw together a poem that spoke of my feelings about my students. I sat back down at the computer, took a deep breath, and began to type. This time the words came more easily, and by midnight, I was finished. The next morning, though, I was having serious doubts about the whole thing. I was on cloud 9 because the poem I'd written did indeed express my feelings, my deepest feelings. On the other hand, I wasn't sure the students would relate. I figured I would have been better off trying to go for some humor. Plus, I didn't think I had the confidence to open up to my students this way. Before they arrived in class, I tried to make the room as warm and inviting as I could. Hundreds of Christmas lights strung from the high ceiling allowed us to turn off those dark fluorescent tube ceiling lights, and arranging the desks in a circle helped the ambiance too. The mood when the students took their seats was electric. They couldn't wait to share their poetry. Some had written multiple poems. As they took turns reading, all remained attentive, kind, and supportive. What a beautiful scene to behold. Everything was working out better than I'd even hoped. I guided the process, but I never mentioned my own poem. Then near the end of the class period, one of the boys asked, "Mrs. Kidd, did you write a poem?" "Yeah, I did," I answered quietly. They asked me to read it, but I told them I couldn't. "Why not?" they wanted to know. "Because if I read it, I'm going to cry." I will never forget the responses, the way the whole class immediately reacted with tenderness to support and encourage me. Wait a minute, isn't it supposed to be the other way around? Me encouraging them? "Mrs. Kidd, you can do it." "Oh, come on, Mrs. Kidd, we're here for you." And so I pulled out my poem and I began to read. I barely made it through the first 2 lines when the tears started flowing. It got worse as I felt my throat tightening. Multiple times I had to stop and try to collect myself before I could continue. I cried. No, more accurately, I heaved and I blubbered through the whole poem. Finally, it was over. After a brief moment of silence, applause, and the heaping on of compliments followed. "Wow, I really like that. Oh, Mrs. Kidd, that was so good. Can I have a copy of your poem?" The poem was called Blessed, and every stanza ended with the refrain, "Blessed am I to be their teacher." I'd like to say that my poem was a literary masterpiece. It was not. But It resonated with my target audience, and that was all I'd ever wanted it to do. I had made myself vulnerable to these students, and they responded with love. They listened and they got it. Staff members later told me how thrilled the kids were to have a copy of the poem in their room, how eager they were to share the poem with them and with their own family members. On that special day, the students understood how deeply I cared for them, and I understood more clearly how vitally important it was for them to know they mattered. In the end, isn't that what we all long for? To feel seen and loved, and to know that we matter? I love Bill's reminder to each of us to let our light shine so that when others see us, they see the very love and compassion of Christ. Unfortunately, there are countless numbers of people around us who don't feel their worth, people who have no idea of the divine light they carry within themselves. But when we sense Christ within us, we have opportunities to help others discover their light. Opening our eyes and hearts, we can uplift people and help them feel seen and valued just as they are. We can even do it beginning with something as simple as a smile, a kind word, an embrace. We can strive to create ripples of compassion until all souls can sense their worth and feel their divine light. Light sharing light, and everyone belonging to the one true light of love. Amen.